Today's podcast is brought to you by Freetrade, the commission-free investment platform. Head to freetrade.io/PensionCraft and get started today. You've done the maths, you've cut the lattes, you've maxed the ISA, and you're still decades away from financial freedom. So how are some people retiring in their 30s and 40s while the rest of us are stuck on the hamster wheel?
We separate the FIRE movement fantasy from reality. What works, what's wishful thinking, and whether there's a middle ground between grinding until you're 70 and living on beans on toast to quit at 35. And in today's dumb question of the week, how much will I spend in retirement? All right, let's get into it. So I think it's fair to say that everyone wants to retire at some point. And traditionally, that would be in your 60s, I guess. But there's a group of people, the FIRE movement, who want to retire much earlier than that and achieve financial freedom. So FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. So what's the deal here, Roman? Is it just a case of trying to pile up a huge load of money and then quit your job?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about the RE bit of it, the retire early. I think a lot of it is about financial independence and having a choice about what you do in life, rather than having to grind at some job you don't particularly like, perhaps. You've got more choice about what you do, such that if you don't have that requirement for a certain level of income, maybe you could work in the charitable sector or just do a passion project or build a company. So all of that, I think, is admirable. But the real question is it attainable? Is it possible over a reasonable time frame?
Well, people have done it. People have written books on it, which I've read. And it all comes back to a basic core idea, which is that you've got to accumulate enough assets and they've got to be invested in the right things that the maths works out, that you can safely withdraw enough income from your portfolio, basically in perpetuity or for as long as you're going to live.
Yeah, so what you're going to end up with is a perpetual pot, which doesn't shrink in real terms. And that's the really important point here. The big difficulty is matching inflation such that the size of your investment pot doesn't shrink over time. And that's really difficult over the longer term. And here we are really talking about the longer term. If you retire age 40, well, look, you're going to live probably for another 50 years. So that pot better last. Otherwise, you may not be able to top it up, because if you've been out of the workplace for a long period of time, it may be quite difficult to pick up a new job.
So I guess the obvious place to start is, well, how big does the pot need to be? Now, if you listen to FIRE bloggers or podcasters, they'll typically be American and they'll typically reference the 4% rule, which is saying that you could possibly withdraw 4% of your starting pot every year and increase that amount by inflation each year. So if you flip that around, it basically means you need 25 times your annual living expenses invested to meet this safe withdrawal rate. But there's a lot of caveats involved, isn't there?
Yeah, so the research that this is based on is largely from Bengen, and this was done for the United States. So that's the first point. Returns in the US have been very different from the rest of the world, generally higher, certainly recently. It also doesn't consider fees. So if you've got some kind of setup where you're paying 2% in fees, well, suddenly you're going to have to earn a lot more in order to beat those fees year by year.
Doesn't include taxes either, which a lot of people overlook.
Yeah, so this is net of tax. Now in the UK, we're kind of lucky because we've got very generous tax schemes. So potentially you could use those and not pay a lot of tax over the course of your lifetime.
The other thing that the research is clear about is it's modelling a 30-year retirement period. And as you just said, if you're retiring early, you might be living on your savings for a lot longer than 30 years, and the 4% rule would fail, even for Americans, where the returns are like the past and where inflation's like the past.
Because it's more likely you're going to have these awful periods where you've got a succession of drawdowns, where you have awful returns or very high inflation for an extended period of time. Either of those amounts to the same thing, which is depletion of your pot. So I think having that understanding that you have to generate long-term returns, which means you need some risky assets, but at the same time, that can mean that you have periods of unlucky returns. And that becomes more likely the longer you are in retirement.
The other thing to say is that the 4% rule, which everyone talks about, is backward looking. It's saying what would have been the worst 30-year period in the past, where it would have just scraped by and not run out of money. It doesn't say that the next 30 years couldn't be even worse than that. if you're being pessimistic. I think the other thing to remember from the point of view of a UK investor is that, I'm just going to say it, Romin, 4% is too high if you look at the back tests. And that's basically because the UK's record when it comes to inflation is quite a bit worse than that of the US.
Yeah, some of the numbers that come out of Dimson Marsh Staunton, which I'm always quoting, over this period between 1900 and 2024, inflation in the UK averaged 3.5%, whereas in the US it was 2.9%. Now that average, of course, over a long period of time, masks periods of very, very, very high inflation. We had it in the 70s, for example, in the UK. And in the US as well, there was a period of very high inflation.
Yeah, and you say it masks a lot, which it does. There's been really high peaks in the UK. But even that 0.6 percentage point difference compounded over a century is a huge difference in inflation. And so the impact is, if the future resembles the past, then you should expect to be able to withdraw a lower percentage each year if you're based in the UK. Now, I think we both like the Monovator blog, don't we, in the UK? They do some great research and they write really well about UK investments. They looked at, if you went back a century, what would the safe withdrawal rate likely be in the UK, assuming you're invested in some normal kind of stock bond portfolio? The number they came up with is 3.1% for a 30-year retirement. That's a lot lower than 4%.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a bit too pessimistic, to be honest. I think in the UK, now we've got the Bank of England, which is supposedly independent. Let's hope it stays that way. And perhaps they're more on the ball when it comes to monetary policy. So hopefully that's not going to be a problem in the future as much as it has been in the past.
But if you believe Monovator's numbers, and there's always the caveat that data from 100 years ago might not be that reliable, but anyway, put that to one side. If you believe the data, then the safe withdrawal rate from history in the UK does appear to be around 3.1%. And they highlight a difference between the UK and the US, where it looks like in the US, mixing in some bonds to your portfolio long term actually boosts the safe withdrawal rate because they cushion the downturns in equity markets. Whereas in the UK, it looks like 100% equity historically would have been the best portfolio because gilts have suffered in those periods of very high inflation. But here's a question for you, Romin. People might be listening to this thinking, yeah, I'm a UK investor, but I'm not just invested in the UK. I can invest in the US. I could put everything in the US if I wanted to. Couldn't I then have the 4% rule?
Yeah, unfortunately, you have to live with UK inflation. If you live here, then your living expenses are going to be linked to the prices that you pay here in the UK. If you could buy all your shopping in the United States and ship it over, yeah, maybe that would...
Shipping costs are going to ruin that, Romin.
UK inflation is what you have to live with. Now, what you could do potentially is if you are going to get exposure to the bond market, use inflation-linked gilts. But those come with their own difficulties. They're very complex to understand. And they bake in a fairly high rate of inflation. So you'd have to have higher than that in order to make it justified to buy inflation-linked bonds.
You know, that's what I was thinking when you were saying, oh, we've got an independent Bank of England now, inflation's going to be moderate. I was thinking, well, look at the break-even rate on these linkers. Market doesn't believe it.
But I think what's really important here is that we've highlighted that inflation's what you have to beat, particularly over these very long-term periods. That's really what you should be focused on.
And if you're living off your portfolio, not only do you have to beat inflation, but you have to beat it by enough that you can live off the surplus.
Yeah, another way of thinking of sustainable withdrawal rate is how much is inflation eating away at your pot every year? So let's say that's 3%. And then how much extra do you get every year, which is your real return? So let's say your real return is 5%. Well, that's above inflation. And that means that leaving a bit of a margin for error and runs of bad luck, maybe you could withdraw 4% a year. So that's where the 4% rule comes from.
And that would all be great if the average was what you got every year. But the complication is sequence of returns, where if you're unlucky and the market takes a dive early in your retirement, the average isn't going to save you, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems, which is that if you do have this really long-term horizon, you need to have enough risky assets there to keep the real value of the portfolio high enough and to generate the growth. But that in turn means you're very susceptible to big drawdowns in risky assets. Now, if you did have some safe assets which you could live off, well, that's not a problem while you wait for equity to recover. But essentially what you've got here is sequencing risk that lasts an entire lifetime. by which I mean you've got to sell something to eat. And if you've only got risky assets in your portfolio, 100% equity, well, you're going to have to withdraw from a depleted pot. And that means your depletion rate increases during these periods when equity markets tumble year after year.
And then that stuff that you've eaten does not compound, and it affects you, well, for the rest of your life, basically.
Now, in an ideal world, maybe you'd have some kind of part-time work that you could fall back on in order to top up your pot during these rough times. But of course, what often happens during these periods of market drawdowns is economic weakness as well, which means in turn that it's more difficult to find a job. So, there is no easy solution here.
But to just wrap up this discussion of safe withdrawal rates, if people in the US are thinking about 4%, and I've even seen Bengen come out recently and say maybe it's more like 5%, but people in the UK are thinking, I don't know, maybe 3.1%, that might not sound like a huge difference, right? But it makes a big difference to how big your starting pot needs to be to account for your annual living expenses. So the difference between a 3.1% safe withdrawal rate and a 4% withdrawal rate means you have to have a 29% larger pot at retirement.
Now, we should caution people against false precision here because all of these are very, very broad rules of thumb. So, will 0.1% difference be significant here? Probably not, because there's huge uncertainty about future returns and with safe withdrawal rates.
And it's also a question of how comfortable are you with the risk of running out of money. So you could run a 4% withdrawal rate in the UK and maybe you'd have a failure rate of like 15%. That's too high for me, but some people might be happy with that.
So it's always good to consider what would happen in your country if you did run out of money. Would you be literally penniless and on the street? And of course, in the UK, you wouldn't be. In other countries, I know that if you do run out of money, then unless your family is willing to pay for you, you may well find yourself homeless. So really, I think you have to take into account how awful that outcome would be. I mean, it wouldn't be comfortable to have run out of money. You would be dependent on your family, and nobody wants to do that at that point in your life. And we've also assumed that you're kind of an unthinking robot, where in year one you take 4% or 3.1%, and then every year after that you inflation adjust based on the RPI numbers or the CPI numbers. Well, look, nobody's going to do that. If there is a bad year, presumably you tighten your belt and withdraw less, and that reduces the effect on the longevity of your pot and extends the lifetime of your pot. So as long as you keep to those guardrails, which could mean a depletion of your income significantly, you might be okay over the longer term.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is that all these spreadsheets and the assumptions assume that you're a bit of an idiot who's just going to eat your pot into oblivion as you see it dwindling and like headlines of market crash. Whereas in reality, I think if there is a bit of squishiness in your budget, you would tighten your belt, wouldn't you? It's just human nature.
And it's not that difficult to actually implement. There are various withdrawal rules that you can follow where they do adjust based on the size of the pot and also recent returns.
So we've said a lot about this mythical pot that people are building up and how big it might need to be. Now, how do you get there, right? The whole idea of FIRE is there's this kind of journey where you accumulate the pot, hopefully as quickly as possible if your goal is to retire. What's the maths on this side of the equation like? What matters here?
Well, to state the obvious in the first place, you have to save a lot of money. Ideally, the more you can save early on, the better, and that's because of the effects of compounding. Any money you can save when you're in your 20s is going to be compounding for a lot longer and give you a much bigger pot than money you put in later in the saving phase. But of course, when you start out in your career, usually you're not very well paid. And unfortunately, that means that you don't really benefit fully from the compounding. But ideally, what you'd be doing, and I laughed when you said about baked beans, but you'd spend as little as possible on frivolous stuff and just focus on your core expenses.
Yeah, there's a famous chart from Mr. Money Mustache, who is one of the original FIRE bloggers. Like, he's got a funny name, and he's got a bit of a cult that he's cultivated around himself. I like him. And his approach is very much on the frugal side of things, like live like a student, pile money into the equity market, and you can retire surprisingly quickly. And what his chart highlights is the fact that your savings rate, how much of your income you're putting aside and investing, is incredibly powerful when it comes to how much longer you'll have to work. And that's because of two reasons, right? One, if you've got a high savings rate, well, there's obviously more money going into the market for you. But also, that means that your expenses are lower, as in you're spending less to live each year. So therefore, when you do retire, if you can keep spending that small amount, your pot doesn't need to be as big. Now, his numbers are conditioned on a couple of variables. He's assuming 5% real returns and a 4% safe withdrawal rate. Neither's particularly controversial. But the upshot is, if your savings rate is 10%, then you would have to work 51 years until you can retire. If you double your savings rate to 20%, then you have to work 37 years till you retire. But if you're on the FIRE mission, you'll see people having a savings rate of like 50%, which would mean just 17 years until you might be able to retire. It drops quite rapidly the higher you get your savings rate up, but maybe that means more and more baked beans.
The thing is, I remember when I was a bachelor, which was quite a long time ago, but I remember that then I had control over my spending. But then I found once I was in a relationship, then the control over how much you spend becomes very different. Now, it may be a good idea that if you want to save 50% of your income, you find a partner up front who's willing to live with that, who's willing to share your baked beans.
That's my experience too, Roman, is that eventually life starts to get in the way. And for me, it was kids when my savings rate just cratered.
Yeah, your priorities change very rapidly. When you get those little kids in the house, it's very difficult to refuse them anything. So it's natural that your spending is going to increase massively because you need all that stuff to maintain the survival of your children.
It was an interesting point you made, though, about how it might be harder in a relationship to manage your expenditures. But then there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about DINKs. Have you heard this? Dual income, no kids, which is the ideal situation for saving because you can share a house and a bedroom and a lot of expenses if you're in a couple. And if you don't have a couple of toddlers running around causing chaos and spending money every day, then FIRE, I think, in that situation is much more of a realistic target.
Now, I do speak to a lot of couples who don't have children, and they're in a very strong position when it comes to saving. Not for that reason. I don't think people come out and say, oh, we'll do the FIRE thing and we won't have kids.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. There's the kids column on the spreadsheet with a multiplier depending on how many kids you have. I've seen that is the primary reason, actually, for the lower fertility rates in the West, is it's not that fewer couples have children. It's that there are a lot fewer big families. Lots of people are happy with just one kid now.
Yeah, I heard that in China, they call these single kids who get loads of attention and toys lavished upon them, they call them little emperors, which I just thought was brilliant.
But maybe you can reach FIRE with a little emperor. But if you've got like 3 or 4 little emperors, I'm thinking that's harder.
But there is one thing which we swept under the carpet slightly here, which is to do with uncertainty. And it's a topic I love, of course. So I've done some sums.
Oh, here we go.
So in PensionCraft, we've got this calculator which does Monte Carlo simulation, which takes this uncertainty into account. So you tell it the average return on your investment, but you also tell it a critical number, which is the volatility of those investments. So 100% equity, if it's globally diversified, probably has a volatility of around 14%, roughly. What that means is that you may be saving enough on average to have enough in retirement, but because of the uncertainty, you could just be unlucky. So the way to reframe it is to say, if I want a 99% probability of hitting this goal, this savings goal, how much would I have to save per year? Or you could say 50% probability, if you're willing to gamble a bit with your future.
Well, let's pretend we're not willing to gamble. Let's go for the 99% chance of building up a big enough pot.
Well, that certainty makes a huge difference. So if over a 20-year horizon, you want to build up £1 million, assuming inflation's around 2% a year, and you're going to increase the amount you save by that inflation rate, well, then you'd have to save just under $50,000 a year to have a 99% chance of meeting your goal. Whereas if a 75% chance of meeting the goal would be okay, you'd only have to start at $27,000 a year. So it makes a huge difference to get that additional certainty.
Yeah, that's a big difference, isn't it? I don't think I've internalized those numbers as much as you have. Let's hope we're lucky in terms of the returns then.
Another way of thinking about that and kind of flipping it around, most people save over a 40-year period, right, from age 20 to age 60, roughly. So if we use that as our benchmark, there is this non-linear relationship between the period of time which you're going to save for and the amount of money you need to save to get a certain level of certainty for reaching your goal. So if instead of 40 years, you go for 20 years, you roughly quintuple the amount you have to save per year. So half the period means 5 times the amount you have to save.
I guess that's the consequence of relying on compound returns to do a lot of the heavy lifting. That little differences in sequencing and average returns can make a huge difference over the long term. I was thinking about this earlier, actually. There's kind of a way to really break down the maths into a soundbite here when it comes to FIRE. So the goal is driven by your expenses. That's going to determine how big your pot needs to be. The timeline, as in how long it's going to take to build that pot, depends on your savings rate and luck of the markets. And then the heavy lifting is done by equity returns plus time.
Is this going to be one of those weird equations that appears in the tabloids now and then?
Yeah, I need you to give me some sort of Greek symbols for all of these things, please, Roman. But I think it does highlight the things which actually make a difference, right? The levers you can pull. The savings rate, which can be influenced by earning more, spending less. Your investment returns, which is basically asset allocation and then keeping your fees low. And then time, which is starting early.
And being healthy, I think that's another important one. If you're not well, then clearly it's going to make it more difficult to earn. But also, when it comes time to spend the money, you won't be in any kind of fit shape to enjoy FIRE.
But is FIRE the thing worth aiming for? I think that's what we need to talk about, Roman, after the break.
This episode is sponsored by Freetrade. Right now, you can get 2% cash back when you transfer £10,000 or more in pensions to Freetrade. Switch to one of the UK's cheapest SIPP providers. With a Freetrade pension, there's just one flat fee, zero commission, and access to over 6,500 stocks, bonds, and funds, all in one easy-to-use investing app. Visit freetrade.io/PensionCraft to start your transfer. Capital at risk. Other charges may apply. SIPP eligibility rules and terms and conditions apply. Cashback is capped at £1,000 per customer and the offer ends 31st of December 2025.
Okay, Roman, I think it's fair to say everyone's had enough maths by now. Let's move on to the psychology of this thing. What do you reckon? Is FIRE a worthwhile goal? Is this what people should be aiming for?
I think it depends on your view of retirement. If you think it's just going to be a holiday, then no, I don't think that's worthwhile at all. I don't think it's about sitting on a beach for the rest of your life or just going on holiday after holiday. I think most people find work rewarding, and substituting something else rewarding for what would normally be considered work is probably the way to go. Just to stay happy, I think that's what keeps people fulfilled. And also breaking this link between income, the level of income you achieve, which is such an important goal for so many people, and has to be if you need to save a lot early on, and the reward you get from work, which is the value to society of what you do. I think breaking that linkage is really a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think that's right from a societal point of view. A lot of people are working in jobs that they really don't enjoy, and they don't want to do it forever. But the biggest upside I see of financial independence is you're kind of buying time. You could take that money you're earning and have a flashy car or go on a 5-star holiday, or you could invest it, delay gratification somewhat, I guess, and buy yourself quite a lot more time down the road, hopefully.
Another problem, I think, is that you may not have that time. You could get diagnosed with some kind of illness. You'd have scrimped and saved all those years, denied yourself, and then suddenly realised that your life was fairly severely curtailed. Well, in that case, you could splurge some of the money, but I don't think that would be very comforting, given that you'd have given up on so much pleasure in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, isn't it? You don't want to sort of over-optimize early on, defer all joy, live a kind of joyless frugality with the hope of this kind of bonanza of retirement. But then you don't want to kind of ignore retirement and never be able to get there. It's one of those tricky things, right? And where you draw the line is going to be different for everyone. Most people probably don't even think about it, let's be honest.
And I think the place you live as well makes a big difference. As we said, if there's that safety net with the social support you'd get in retirement if you didn't have enough money, or if, say, you need health insurance, which is what a lot of Americans need. So that is a big concern for people, particularly as they get older. How will I be looked after when my health isn't as good?
So I think both of us, Romin, have somewhat of a problem with the retire early element of the phrase. Or at least that's not necessarily the goal. But I see a huge amount of upside to the FI part, the financial independence, even if you want to carry on working. I mean, for a start, once you've got enough money saved that you could, in theory, walk away, even if it's just for a few years, then your negotiation power goes up massively with your employer and with any other employer you're talking to.
Now, for some people, that might make them take their foot off the accelerator pedal. And just take it easy at work, just coast. You don't have to be the best person, in the company if it's a case that you're financially independent. For others, I think they carry on working in exactly the same way. And that's because of this thing about work, which is that it gives you self-worth. It defines you as a person. But in banking, of course, it was called the FU number rather than FI, where you could turn around to your boss and tell them...
FI. Yeah. I think we all want to get to that stage, right?
Yeah.
But on a more serious point there, though, even if you are stepping away for a few years, you never know when you might need to come back or join the workforce. So maybe don't burn the bridges on the way out. And I think that's a danger, actually. If people do manage to retire at 40 and then, you got really bad sequence of returns or something, and you do need to earn some money, you probably don't want to have let all your professional networks atrophy in that time.
Yeah, I think it depends on the career you're in. A lot of people I speak to, they have a consultancy business where they can pretty much dip in and out. So they can keep their hand in with minimal work and keep the contacts. But as you say, it does atrophy over time if you don't do it regularly.
Once you get a certain level of financial independence, though, I think your ability to choose and your optionality goes way up. And I think that in itself might help you enjoy your career more. If you just know that you can make a change, you could switch careers and take an earnings hit for a while. You could take a sabbatical. Just knowing that's possible, I think, makes the day-to-day easier. Certainly less stressful.
Yeah, knowing you could walk out makes it less of an onus, I think. And I think takes some of the stress out of the workplace as well. But we talked about FIRE very much as if it's an all or none choice. And I don't think that's the case, is it? There are various flavours of FIRE, which I'd never heard of, which you've researched, which I thought were hilarious.
Yeah, I've come across 4 or 5 different sort of sub-brands of FIRE, and they all have their own forums on Reddit. And they all actually make a bit of sense when you think about them and might suit different people. So first up, you've got Coast FI. And that means you've saved enough that with compounding, you can basically coast to retirement. You don't even need to save anything extra now. You can spend everything you're earning, knowing that by the time you get to your 60s, the pot will be there. It will have grown for you.
Now, presumably you've put this into your Monte Carlo simulator and the probability of reaching that goal is 99%. But yeah, I think that certainly applies to some of the people I do coaching with. They're quite young, they've sold a business, and they're pretty much there already, if you take compounding into account.
We've mentioned before, actually, how some people have probably already made their kids Coast FI because they put enough into a SIPP that over the course of 50 or 60 years, the kid's going to retire with like £1 million, even if they don't do anything other than keep it invested in the market.
Yeah, I think personally I'm glad I didn't do that for my kids. They may not be glad about it, but I certainly don't think I'd have done that because I just think it's good to graft a bit during the course of your life and make a contribution to society, and something's got to make you get out of bed. That's certainly true for me, I had to get out of bed to pay the mortgage.
But the kids are going to have to get out of bed and work because they can't access that SIPP until they're, 57, but it'll be higher by the time they retire.
Yeah, but will they coast, do you think? Will they just not work very hard at all and not contribute as much to society because they don't need the money?
Well, maybe, if they're happy to wait till they're 60 to have a reasonable standard of living.
Yeah, I suppose even though you're going to get a good retirement, you'd still want to fill that gap as best you can.
Okay, so that's Coast FI. The next one I came across was Barista FI. Okay, stick with me. So This is basically when you get some level of financial independence and you can step away from your career, but you take on a kind of low stress or part-time job that covers the gap between what your portfolio is producing and what you actually need to live. Now, this one I think is particularly popular with Americans because of that healthcare thing you mentioned earlier, which is that in America, it's employers who give you health insurance, unless you want to pay a lot for it out of your own pocket. So people will take on the kind of minimum level of work they can do in a low stress environment, a barista, say, to give them the health insurance and a bit of pocket change while their portfolio does the rest.
So in the UK, this would be B&Q FI. Doesn't have the same ring to it, does it?
Well, I thought retrospectively, this is kind of what I've happened to be doing right now because it's like podcast FI, isn't it? I'm just getting a bit of money from the podcast, but it's not enough to pay the living expenses. Do you want a couple of other niche FIRE strategies?
Yep, fire away.
All good. So there are two related to the different philosophies of how much you want to spend. So there's lean FIRE, which is the frugal thing. You're running a tight budget. You're not spending lavishly on anything, and you're just desperate to quit, I guess, and get the minimum amount you need to live without going to work. And a lot of the people doing this will do something called geographic arbitrage, as they call it, where they might move to a low cost of living country, often in Asia, where their money will go a lot further.
So I've seen a lot of content creators do that, don't they? They're digital nomads. They move to the Philippines or Thailand, and they make videos about the lifestyle there.
And fair enough, I guess. If you want to live in one of those countries, then they're happy to have you. Your dollars are going to go a lot further in Thailand, I imagine.
I think that's the reasoning, isn't it? And the lifestyle's good, so, while you're young, that's probably okay. As you're clapped out and old, like me, you'd probably be more reluctant to go somewhere which is not so familiar.
And at the other extreme, maybe, is fat FIRE, which is not at all about living frugally and is about living in comfort and spending as much as you want to spend, and therefore building up a huge pot. Now, this is where maybe it sounds a bit elitist, but it's people who earn a lot and are willing to put away enough of that money that they can continue living a rich person's lifestyle even after early retirement. That one is definitely not accessible to everyone.
That's surprisingly varied, isn't it? All those different flavours of FIRE.
Yeah, there's something for everyone. I mean, FIRE has a lot of critics and it is quite polarizing. For a few reasons, I guess. Some people see it as just lazy, I guess, to want to step away from work early, or bad for society that people might want to do that. Others just see it as a rich person's pursuit, and promoting this to everyone is unfair because most people can't realistically get there unless they just live on beans on toast forever. But I actually think there's something good in the message, and it's beneficial for people to hear this stuff and know that there is that possibility out there. Because basically what FIRE is taking good financial advice and going quite extreme with it, right? So the advice of save more money, invest it in the market, do the maths and work out what you can realistically spend and plan for your retirement. All that stuff is good. It's just, do you want to go to the extreme that you can retire in your 40s, say?
I think selling it as a dream may be difficult because it is unrealistic, I think, for many people on an average salary to achieve this. And that should be very clear up front. And I think a lot of the content I've seen suggests that it's more easily achievable than it truly is. I think for most people who do achieve it, it's accidental FIRE. You just happen to have some lucky investments, or you inherit money, or your business does better than you expect. All of these things might lead you to independence.
Yeah, it's that kind of grand designs thing, isn't it? Where you watch the show and it's like a couple, one of them is like a freelance illustrator, one of them's a palm reader, and they have a budget of 2.6 million to buy a house. You're like, where'd that money come from? That's the British way though, isn't it? Everyone's reliant on inheritance at the moment. But it leads me on to a question, Robin, which is maybe a bit provocative, but is the UK a good place to achieve FIRE if that's what you want? Or is it easier in America?
I mean, I have lived in the United States, and I'd say there are more opportunities there. Just to give a crazy example, I was working for my mum, weirdly, for some company, and they realised I was a bit of a tech nerd, and I wanted to do physics, but I fixed something at their workplace, and then someone in the building found out about it, some millionaire, and said, I want you to come and work for me. I said, no, I want to go and do physics. But, that kind of opportunity and that idea of wealth building on wealth and having the opportunities, the contacts, and that whole entrepreneurial culture, I think that's very different from the UK. And also the general level of wealth. I think America's a more wealthy country than the UK. That's just a fact.
Yeah, their wages are much higher for equivalent roles. You see that if you're in a company, actually, and there's a US office and the UK office. If the people in the US find out what the UK salaries are, like, what? Really?
Let me send you some food parcels.
Yeah. So from that point of view, it must be harder to achieve FIRE in the UK just because our wages are lower and our expenses are lower, sure, but not by the same degree, I think, that the salaries are. But there are some advantages, I think, to the UK over the US if you're pursuing financial independence. A big one is the NHS, right? It has its problems, but it is free at the point of use. And health insurance can be a major cost if you're an early retiree in America.
I guess you could say that we pay higher taxes in order to have an NHS in the first place. So there is that idea of spreading the cost across the entire community. Now, that definitely benefits you when you're older, because that's when you generally need more in terms of demands on the national health, and that's when you suffer most ill health.
I mean, America's just tried to get to the age where they can qualify for Medicare, don't they? Then it's less of a burden, the health insurance. It's that gap between, let's say you retire at 45 and whenever Medicare kicks in.
So I guess what that does effectively is shift the amount of money such that you have less money early on because you're paying higher taxes. And maybe you have more money later on because you're not paying crazy medical bills. But unfortunately, compounding doesn't favour the UK approach. It favours the US approach, if you're willing to invest.
Yeah. And you mentioned tax. I'm unclear about whether UK or US tax is beneficial here. So definitely our tax rates are higher in the UK. And there are some really annoying parts of the tax code where your marginal tax rate can get up to 60%, right? We know if you earn just over £100,000, which makes it hard to squirrel away a lot of money. But then we do have very powerful tax shelters. An ISA allowance of £20,000 a year per person, up to £60,000 in a pension each year where you don't pay capital gains tax or dividend tax.
And we did that whole episode, didn't we, where we worked out all of the things you could use. And it goes way beyond the ISA and the SIPP.
Yeah, you've got capital gains tax allowances, dividend allowances, gilts, which are free of capital gains tax, certain gold investments, which you don't pay capital gains tax on. There's a lot, right, in the UK, which makes it advantageous, I think, when you've built the pot. This is my thing, Robin. Building the pot is hard in the UK, but once you've built it, it's actually not so bad.
Maybe there'll be a change in culture in the UK, so it is more entrepreneurial, and the government policies will also enable that. However, I wouldn't hold your breath.
Because once you're at that age where you're drawing on your pot, you do have the state pension to look forward to, which is inflation-linked, at least for now, better than inflation-linked, triple locked, which could pay for a lot of your costs when you get to that age, your essentials. But then the accumulation phase is hard, especially if you've got kids. We know housing costs are really high, especially in London and the southeast. Childcare costs are extortionate in the UK compared to other countries. Yeah. One of the highest in the world when you look at it relative to incomes. I think I saw some stats where only Switzerland is higher if you're paying privately. You also have this bridging problem, in a way similar to the US healthcare problem of bridging to Medicare, whereas we can't access our private pensions until, well, it'll be 57 and going up to 58 and who knows how high. So you've got to bridge that gap. And if you're retiring early, you might not have got a full national insurance record and be on track for the full state pension.
I've got 1 year to go.
You give me periodic updates. We've been doing this podcast nearly 4 years. Every time you go, 4 years to go, 3 years to go, 2 years to go. You're almost fire, Robin.
Yay. I think there's a cultural difference here as well, which is in the US, wealth isn't frowned upon as much as it is in the UK. The culture in the UK is very much, if you've got lots of money, it's almost frowned upon, I'd say.
You have to pretend that you don't have lots of money. That's the thing.
Exactly. That you're just a normal person. Which, of course, you are, but you just happen to have a bigger bank account.
Yeah, and it's easy to pretend in the UK because you go, yeah, I've got this little tiny house, 3 bedrooms. It's not much. Worth 1.8 million, though. It's in London.
Whereas in the US, I think it goes the other way. People almost worship people who are successful and wealthy and there it's much more accepted. There's almost a cult of wealth.
So it's kind of weird, isn't it, that the FIRE movement took off in the US, given how much, at least in the early days, it was about frugality.
But the goal clearly here is to become one of those wealthy people, or at least wealthy enough.
If you're on this path, Roman, to FIRE, you've got your spreadsheet, you can see your future mapped out in front of you, all being well, and you've got 15 years to work. What have you got to be aware of there?
I think one difficulty is just realizing that your circumstances may impinge on this really nice, beautiful idea. And it may be that the amount you spend gradually increases over time if you don't keep a really tight check on it. This is called lifestyle creep.
There's a phrase that I came across again and again when I was reading the FIRE forums, which is the boring middle. And what that seems to be referring to is a psychological problem. Whereas when you first discover about FIRE and you're like, oh my goodness, I could retire in 15 years if I do this. This is amazing. And you get really excited, you build your spreadsheets, you got your budget, you're saving the money, investing the money, your pot's growing, everything's good. And you know that when you're approaching your goal, it's going to be exciting too. Wow, I can push the button any time now. But then you've got 15 years to go, right? There's this boring middle where you've just got to execute on the plan. Don't waste the money. Don't allow lifestyle creep in. Don't watch the markets too closely. Just keep putting the money in, going to work 9 to 5. And I think this is where people can go off the rails because the middle is boring. If you have this dream in mind and you're so focused on that FIRE target.
I've got to say my diet's pretty similar at the moment. I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but I want to lose 12 kilograms. I've lost 7, and that last 5 is just proving really difficult.
7's pretty good, Roman. You've lost 7 kilos.
Yeah, that's why I'm this ugly bag of bones, mate. Bag of bones and skin.
So you're in the boring middle of the diet, is it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, shall I tell you what really crushed me? We met some friends recently. We don't see them very often. And I said to them, yeah, I've lost 7 kilograms. He said, well, I'm pleased that you've lost the weight, Roman, but I think you must have gained it and lost it since we last saw you because you look just the same. That really crushed me.
Oh, that's not what you say to someone who's on a diet.
Are you listening, Foxy? But I can see that would be a problem, just sticking with it, because it is so difficult.
Yeah, I think lifestyle creep is a real psychological problem to overcome because you're doing it for a long time and you're probably earning a lot of money, right, if you're on this FIRE path, but you're not living like you earn a lot of money at all. And you're seeing your peers who are in equivalent jobs, presumably in nicer houses with bigger cars or whatever. And I think you have to be quite self-confident to avoid that keeping up with the Joneses trap. My approach to it, I think, is try and work out what actually makes you happy. Forget everybody else. What makes you happy and spend lavishly on those things. That will actually improve your quality of life. But everything else that you don't care about at all, just slash those costs, even if it's what society tells you you should care about.
Yeah, for me, it's dog treats. I just love giving Teddy treats. And fortunately, it's not too expensive.
The biltong budget is a line item in itself, isn't it?
It is in our household, yeah. Now, when I hear the phrase, the boring middle, that suggests that you're going to enter the beautiful sunlit uplands at a certain point in time. And that might not be the case.
Yeah, I guess if you've been so focused on that number, how big the pot needs to be, and you think, all my problems will be solved when I hit that number. There's a concept in psychology of the arrival fallacy.
Yeah, maybe we've experienced this in our own lives. When you reach a goal, it's not quite what you expected. And it may lead to other questions about where your life's going to head next. So I don't think that necessarily will make you happy in itself. Also, I think this idea of reaching a certain number is not healthy. You could retire when you've reached 80% of the goal or 75% of the goal. It just means that you'd have less to spend. So anchoring on a particular number may not be healthy.
And do you think there's also a danger that by having a specific number in mind forever, that you might over-prioritize that versus other decisions you might need to make? Let's say you're in a very unhappy relationship. But as we've said, being in a couple can be good for your expenses, right? So maybe it makes a harder decision to step away from a relationship if you think, oh no, that's going to put my FIRE number further in the future.
Yeah, certainly in my case, having the divorce when I was in my early 50s massively affected my savings. So you do have to take into account that these things will happen and that the plan isn't everything. And I think all of this just reiterates the really fundamental truth that you should retire into something, not retire away from some role. Because ultimately you're aiming for that new stage in your life, which hopefully will be a happier one. Or at least a happy one, not necessarily happier than you were in work. So just be realistic about what you're aiming for and have that self-knowledge about what makes you happy, because then you'll be able to build that career post-retirement, which is sustainable.
And don't underestimate the value of a little bit of income after you've pushed the button and formally retired. Let's say you even just earn £10,000 a year from a bit of part-time work. If you use one of those safe withdrawal rates, 4% or whatever, that means you have to have saved up, like £250,000 less money? That's a big thing.
So I think FIRE creates the right behaviours. You save a lot early on, hopefully. You're really careful about fees that you pay because that reduces the amount you have. And you look at the asset allocation very carefully and take as much risk as you're comfortable with. But for most of us, I think FIRE is just a happy accident. I think if that's your be-all and end-all, you might end up with a very difficult accumulation period, maybe more difficult than should be the case. So we mentioned this Monte Carlo simulation approach. If you're one of our premium website members, you get access to that tool and lots of other goodies. And to find out more about that, just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week. How much will I spend in retirement? It's an important question, Roman, because it drives all the other assumptions here.
This is a conversation I have a lot with people in coaching sessions, and it varies hugely depending on usually their income before retirement. People don't want to take too much of a step down. So often they'll say, I want, 80% of my working income, or sometimes they say I want more than I had during work years.
Really? That's a bit ambitious, I think.
Well, for some people it's not, because they've done very well with their business sale or whatever it is. Often if you're a business owner, you don't take a huge amount of income while you're working. And then when you sell the business, that's when you get the big payoff. Or they've got an inheritance, which also means a step up in their lifestyle.
But this isn't what most people are spending in retirement. They're spending less than they did when they were working, I assume.
Yeah, that's the default case, I think. And it's really useful to have a yardstick about what the average person in the UK needs to have a kind of basic income, but also moderate income or maybe a comfortable income. And fortunately, there's a website that provides all of that.
Yeah, so there's the Retirement Living Standards Report, which is created in conjunction with the University of Loughborough. And as you say, they break it down for what kind of income someone would need in retirement to have a minimum standard of living, a moderate standard, or a comfortable standard. And they do it by one person or if you're in a couple. And the key thing to say up top is they're assuming you own your own house and you have paid off the mortgage.
So those are pretty big ifs for some people. But it's useful to look at the numbers. So let's say that it's just one person for starters. The minimum level of retirement, where it's pretty frugal, I have to say. For that, you'd need $13,400 a year, and that covers all of your needs with some left over for fun, as they describe it. But it is basic. You're spending about £55 a week on groceries, £30 a month on food out of the home,
and £20 a month on having fun, on activities. So, yeah, it's frugal, right? Although you could fund most of it, almost all of it, if you get the full state pension.
Now, what's fortunate is for all of these numbers, if you've got a couple, because you get the savings of being able to share the expenses, it's not twice the income that you need. So instead of 13,400, you'd have 21,600.
Which would be met by the state pension alone. But there's a big jump up, isn't there, if you want a moderate standard of living, as I assume most people do. They don't want to just be scraping by.
Yeah, it's over 2 times the income. So we jumped from 13,400 a year for one person to 31,700.
And even that's nowhere near a life of luxury. So it's adding in things like a couple of weeks away in 3-star accommodation on a short-haul flight each year.
2 streaming services for your TV.
And 1 takeaway a week. So, it's a nice standard of living, I guess. But what if you want to be comfortable?
Well, now we jump from 31,700 to 43,900. Or for two people, that's 60,600. So now you can spend a lot more on luxuries. So you can spend more on your house. I'm not sure that's a luxury. You have a 3-year-old small car replaced every 5 years. You can spend on taxis, rail fares, and fancier holidays.
And now you're going to a 4-star resort, not a 3-star. Sadly, in the UK, no standard of living is enough for a 5-star holiday, I'm afraid. But how much stock do you put in these numbers, Romin? Are they a good rule of thumb, do you think? To me, it seems really convenient that the minimum standard of living has come out to match the state pension.
Yeah, I think that probably is a coincidence. I'm not sure they fiddle the numbers here. The state pension's gone up quite a bit, because of the triple lock, and it's gone up unsustainably, of course. That's what many people are worried about. But I find this incredibly valuable because when I'm having conversations with people, if they haven't got a number in mind in terms of what their expenditures will be, we can just look at this website as a kind of base level for each of the different standards of life. And then they can adjust accordingly. They could look at the holidays and say, well, actually, I do like 5-star resorts, so I'd need even more. But then they can work out the delta to these numbers.
Yeah, you don't have to look at this website for too long to realise I should be saving more right now. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out PensionCraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Romin Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.